Welcome back. Today we're going to cover torque versus horsepower. This is something I hear and see debated from time to time, so I'm going to cover it from my understanding and in my style. So hopefully you guys will follow along, maybe learn something, maybe you'll disagree with me. There's always that chance too. Let's start off with, where did I learn this stuff? I have learned this all over the place. Cars are really my passion. They are what I enjoy. They're what I want to know about. They're what I go out of my way to learn about. And that's kind of shaped where my knowledge base has come from. I actually started reading magazines when I was very young. So I started on magazines, and then I moved into high school automotive classes, college automotive classes, all kinds of update trainings, seminars, conversations with intelligent automotive minds, and some not so intelligent. Conversations with people that know more than me. There's a lot of those out there. Really, anytime somebody is willing to teach me anything about automotive, I'm pretty much willing to sit down and listen to them. I'll listen to 4 different people try to explain the same topic, and sometimes I'll pick bits and pieces out of each one of those and apply it to my real world understanding. So I'm going to take that and apply it to this to try to explain the difference between torque, horsepower, and which way is right or wrong to look at engines. One of the kind of crazy things about the automotive engine to me is that it's been around for so long, and yet it seems like we are still learning about how it functions and how to optimize it. And that just kind of blows my mind, that this is something that has been in mass production, not just around, but in mass production for over 100 years. And yet we are still learning, still developing, still making this technology better. So along with that, what I'm putting out here today is my belief and understanding at this moment in May of 2020. My opinion on this stuff may change at some point, but as of right now, I wouldn't be putting it out here if I wasn't fairly confident in it. So let's start out with what each one of these things actually are. So torque is a fairly simple one. Torque is a twisting force. So if you take your wrench, put it on a bolt, and turn it, you are applying torque. That's what torque is. Torque is simply a twisting force. It's easily measurable, and that's it. That's all I really need to explain. Torque is a twisting force. Horsepower is a little bit more complicated. So we'll go up to the whiteboard here for that. This is the formula for horsepower. It is a work formula. So if you think back to your physics class in high school, this is a formula to determine how much work is being done by, in this case, an engine. In the United States, we use foot-pounds to express torque. So, even though this is written down like this, it is actually torque. So your torque in foot-pounds times the RPM at which it's being produced divided by 5252 is the work formula that we use to get horsepower. So as you can see here, horsepower is actually a direct relation to torque and RPM. Now here, let me show you something kind of cool. If we extend this over, this is the formula that we have for horsepower if our engine is turning at 5252 RPM. So note that there. So RPM. The RPM would drop off in our equation. So if we take this 5252 RPM and 5252 cancel out, literally any engine that is capable of spinning 5,252 RPM makes exactly the same horsepower and torque at that RPM. So at 5,252 RPM, horsepower and torque are equal on every engine. So if your engine is making 1 foot-pound at that RPM, it's also making 1 horsepower. If you are making 1,000 foot-pounds of torque at 5,252 RPM, you are also making 1,000 horsepower. At any RPM 5,251 or less, your engine will make more torque than horsepower at that given RPM. In fact, at 2,626 RPM, your engine makes half the horsepower that it does torque. As you start at idle and rev up towards 5,252 RPM, your horsepower and torque numbers get closer together. At 5,252 RPM, they actually cross over. And at any RPM, 5,253 or higher, your engine is making more horsepower. The higher you rev it, the farther apart those numbers get. So at 10,504 RPM, your engine actually makes twice as much horsepower as it does torque. Now, not every engine is even capable of revving up to 5252, let alone 10,504. That may not happen for your engine. In fact, 10,504 will not happen for most of your engines. Where did the horsepower formula come from? The simple answer is that it was developed to sell engines when they were transitioning from horses to do work to engines to do work. Back when steam engines were becoming a big thing, people had been traditionally using teams of draft horses to do work, such as spinning water pumps or maybe equipment for factories, things like that. And in order to make their engines marketable, they wanted to be able to show that my steam engine will do the work of 2 horses. So they came up with a work formula based on what horses were capable of doing in a given time frame, and then converted that to engines. So horsepower actually started out as a marketing tool. Horsepower is essentially where your engine makes its torque. That's what it is. The higher the RPM your engine makes its torque numbers, the more horsepower you are going to have. So if you look at something like a common diesel engine, let's use a Cummins for example. So your inline 6, doesn't really matter if it's a 5.9 or a 6.7, Cummins turbo diesel generally makes twice as much torque as it does horsepower. And that's because it's a very low RPM engine. Whereas if you look at your performance cars, like your Corvettes or Ford GTs, any of those type of things, they generally make more horsepower than they do torque. And that's because those engines are revving up higher and making their torque at a higher RPM. I'm going to go ahead and say that they are both valid numbers, but for this video I'm going to focus on 2 things, and that is naturally aspirated and torque. Why torque, not horsepower? Because horsepower is a result of torque. So if you've got an engine that is making large amounts of torque, it will make horsepower. Now, how much horsepower you make is going to depend on where you put it on the RPM curve. We're staying naturally aspirated. What are some things that affect your engine's torque output? First and foremost, engine size. Then we've also got compression ratio, cylinder head design, camshaft selection, part compatibility. So you want to make sure all this stuff actually mixes and matches together. Intake manifolds, exhaust manifolds, exhaust system in general, intake system in general. Short story, pretty much everything. So now that we know what affects our torque output, let's go ahead and do some examples. If you have a naturally aspirated pump gas 87 octane engine, general rule is that if you make 1.25 foot-pounds per cubic inch, you have a pretty awesome setup, and that is about all you're going to get out of a naturally aspirated engine that runs on pump gas. Are there some that make a little bit more than that? Probably. Most engines don't. One of the things that you will hear people say is, oh, this is a torque engine. And while that can be true, most people that are saying this is a torque engine are really saying, my engine sucks. So what does it mean to actually have a good torque engine? And I built one of these that I think is legitimately a good torque engine. It's in a Ramcharger. I wanted to be able to make good power at low RPM. because I want to use this off-road. I want to drive it down the street. I don't really care about quarter-mile performance. I just want it to be a good truck engine. This engine that I built for my Ramcharger is a 360 cubic inch small block Chrysler. I have not dynoed it because I don't have access to one of those, but what I kind of expect for power would be somewhere between 400 and 430 foot-pounds of torque, and maybe around 300 horsepower or possibly even less. Why is that? That engine is built to make its peak power below 4,800 RPM. So while that engine should be making in the neighborhood of 1.15, 1.2 foot-pounds per cubic inch, which is actually a pretty respectable number, it does not have big horsepower numbers to go along with it. So that would be an example of something that is legitimately built and intended to be a torque engine. Most people that say they have a torque engine just have something that doesn't have good heads, doesn't have a good intake. We'll go through some of the 1981 specs for our big three V8 engines. A 1981 360, which is close enough to what could have come in that Ramcharger that will go with it. So in 1981, and I'm going to have to look over at the specs I have written down on this because I don't have them memorized. So a 1981 360 was 170 horsepower and 270 foot-pounds of torque. That's pretty pathetic. That is 0.75 or 3/4 of a foot-pound of torque per cubic inch. That's not very good. Now don't worry though, Chevy and Ford guys, because you're in the same camp. A 1981 350 out of a Chevy pickup, there was actually several different options for this, so I went with the same compression ratio. All three of these engines are roughly the same compression ratio. So the 1981 Chevy 350 was 165 horsepower and 260 foot-pounds of torque. So that's an even slightly worse 0.74 foot-pound per cubic inch, but it's the same. 0.74 to 0.75, they both are terrible. Ford, right in there, right in that mix. In fact, directly between them. The 1981 351 made 136 horsepower, so actually the lowest horsepower out of the three, but their foot-pound is right in the mix at 262 foot-pounds out of a 351, which puts it at 0.745 foot-pounds per cubic inch. All three of those engines were bad. The 80s were terrible for power. All the engines sucked. But somehow, if you put them in a truck, they still did a lot of work. They just did it slower. They did it at a lower RPM. They made good torque, not really on par with today, but they made that torque at a very usable RPM. The peak torque on all three of those engines was under 4,000 RPM, which is where you really want it if you're using a truck to tow weight. And I didn't pull up any specific examples of this, but if you look at your modern V8 engines from Chevrolet, Ford, and Ram, they are all right around 1.2 foot-pounds per cubic inch. So they are significantly better than they were in the 80s, which is not surprising because late 70s to early 80s were a pretty low point for American cars. Now, if horsepower is a factor of where you make your torque, what affects where you make your torque? And I'm going to kind of list these off in the order where I think they are the most important to where your torque is made. Camshaft, cylinder heads, intake manifold, exhaust manifold, and again, part compatibility. I'll dive into boosted just for a second here, and kind of one of your efficiency indicators on a boosted engine is actually the amount of boost it takes to make a certain amount of power. If we have two engines of the exact same displacement, and they make the exact same amount of torque at the same RPM. So let's say engine 1 makes 200 foot-pounds of torque at 3,000 RPM. And it does that with 20 pounds of boost. Now if we have the same displacement, same engine, and we are making that same amount of power at the same 3,000 RPM, but we do it with 5 pounds of boost, That means the second engine is more efficient. Boost pressure in a manifold is actually an indication of restriction. You have a bunch of air that can't get into the engine, and that's where your pressure comes from. Did I answer your question about which one matters, horsepower or torque? Nope. Didn't do that again. Did I teach you some things about horsepower and torque? Hopefully. I'm going to leave it there. I'm not sure if this really helps settle the debate between horsepower versus torque. Personally, I think that they're both important, but I think people put a little bit too much emphasis on horsepower. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you later.